This is probably the best opportunity that we have to put ecology back into economy, and the absolute and dire need for business and policymakers to get together and create accounting models for nature and accounting models where the costs borne by nature are included and integrated. This session will explore the business perspective on India's Naturenomics revolution for a new growth paradigm. How could businesses take the lead in this process of transformation? And what must they do to begin the ecological revolution of the future? We are truly honored to have eminent personalities with us today: Ambassador Mukhopadhyay, Shri Nababrata Bhattacharjee, Mr. Anirban Ghosh, and Dr. T.P. Singh. Our thanks to all of you for joining us today. I also thank all the attendees who are here on the Zoom platform and everyone watching us through our Facebook feed. We request all of you to put in any questions that you might have in the Q&A box that you see on the screen, and we'll try our best to get most of them answered right now live or later via email. I will now introduce our moderator for the session, Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhyay sir. Ambassador Mukhopadhyay has served as India's ambassador to the Republic of Myanmar, Syria, and Afghanistan. During his diplomatic career, Ambassador Mukhopadhyay has also worked to promote India's culture abroad and has coordinated the year-long Festival of India in France. As a career diplomat, he contributed significantly towards promotion of human rights, social development, and advancement of women in international organizations such as the United Nations. I now request Ambassador Sir to introduce our panelists and begin the dialogue. Thank you very much, and over to you, sir.
Thank you, Saurabh. Good evening, viewers. Welcome to part 2 of the inaugural session on a blueprint for Naturenomics, organized by the Bhattacharjee Foundation. I'm sure most of our viewers, all of you, would be familiar with the basic ideas and concepts behind Naturenomics. And if you are not, I hope you've been able to read the concept note or at least attend the first session that was held earlier today at 5 p.m. With Ambassador Chandrasekhar Dasgupta, Dasho Benji Dorji, Ambassador Shyam Saran, and Vandana Shiva. Be that as it may, I think the key words capture the concepts very well. Naturenomics itself, that is nature, economics that actually contributes to nature, natural capital, pretty obvious, natural assets, pretty obvious, rural futures, the idea of a circular economy, and so on. And if you heard our speakers earlier this evening, you would have seen that they would have elaborated in their own ways, some of which was captured by Saurabh just a short while back. We are privileged that for this session on business and policy, we have 3 leading experts from both the worlds of business as well as policy. From the world of business, we have Mr. Anirban Ghosh, Chief Sustainability Officer of the Mahindra Group. And from the world of policy, we have Dr. T.P. Singh, who is the Deputy Regional Director of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, one of the world's oldest and largest conservation networks. And finally, Mr. Nababrata Bhattacharjee, who is the chairperson of the Environment Appraisal Committee of the state government of Meghalaya. So we have perspectives from business, from policy at an international and national level, and we also have a perspective from the Northeast and from the state level. So before I set the ball rolling, let me just say a couple of words about the main problematic that we face here. I think ever since the Industrial Revolution, the relationship between man and nature has been seen to be as, in some ways, extractive and adversarial. In a way, man at the expense of nature. And the cutting edge of that relationship in many ways has fallen on business, on industry. It was the search for profit and trade that led to colonialism. And from colonialism, it went on to imperialism. The Industrial Revolution created a whole pattern of relationships that continue until today. In many ways, if we look at the Northeast, the economy of the Northeast is very much a legacy of the colonial relationship based on tea, timber, oil, rice, and coal. A lot of this, most of it, is extractive, and a lot of the staffing for these industries, in fact, came from outside the Northeast. So this is, I think, the general context in which this is taking place. And I think the fundamental questions that the Bhattacharjee Foundation has has identified for this session is, of course, at the same time, business also has evolved. Today, we have the notion of green business, and Mr. Ghosh in some ways represents that movement towards green business. So the question that we would like all our speakers to keep in mind, even as they talk about their own individual experiences and insights, is first, is there a business case for restoring and protecting ecosystems from degradation to protect corporate guidelines? How can business use this to structure environmental sustainability guidelines that incentivize a movement beyond just minimizing ecological footprints to investing in restoring the environment? And what is the role that business can play together with other stakeholders in the transition to a circular economy, which, as was emphasized by Mr. Bhattacharjee in the afternoon, COVID-19 gives us a particularly good opportunity or a window to transition to? And how would this look like in the context of Eastern Himalayas, to include Northeast India, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, and Myanmar as well? And finally, how can businesses in India better mainstream sustainability practices to become real leaders in demonstrating that business and growth does not have to come at the cost of ecosystem degradation and natural capital loss? So with these words, let me introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker will be Dr. T.P. Singh. Dr. T.P. Singh, as I said, is the Deputy Regional Director of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. He has more than 3 decades of work at the senior management level in natural resource management, administration, organizational leadership, and human resource development. He was originally an officer of the Indian Forest Service. Besides serving in various capacities under state governments as well as the Government of India, he has served as a senior fellow in the Energy Resources Institute, TERI at New Delhi, where he helped set up and served as the Vice Chancellor of TERI's Postgraduate Research University. Dr. Singh has also served as a lead author of reports prepared for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, as an expert for the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and is the author of several international publications. So with those words, allow me to give the floor to Dr. T.P. Singh. We are requesting the speakers to speak with me about 7, maximum 8 minutes. After a first round of interventions, I will address a few questions to each or perhaps to all the panelists. And after that round of questions, we'll be throwing open the floor to the audience. Saurabh will collect and collate those questions, and then we will continue our discussion until 8:30, which is the time that we have. So we have until 8:15, starting now from 7:40, 35 minutes for the panelists and the first round of question and answers. Dr. T.P. Singh, welcome.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Mukhopadhyay, and thanks to Balipara Foundation for organizing this series and for inviting me in this webinar. Sometimes I really feel what would have happened if this pandemic had happened 20 years back. We would have been left with no other mode except to wait for pandemic to be over. A few random thoughts, Ambassador Mukhopadhyay, and let me begin by saying that IUCN, the organization which I belong to, is a membership organization. So we have countries as states as members and civil society as members, academia as affiliate members, and indigenous civil society organizations as members. So we do not take any advocacy role, but what we believe in is providing science and assisting countries and other businesses in terms of providing the best science that which we can gather from all over the world. And based on that science, we then take decisions in terms of, for instance, in this case, how do we mainstream biodiversity into our business practices. The second thing I wanted to introduce here was that, like any other organization which has that type of a structure, we are very careful in terms of how our strategy looks like, how our strategy in terms of engaging with businesses, and also what we expect from businesses looks like. It doesn't mean that we basically are trying to impose anything on anyone. But the fact is that what we would like to see is more than just the CSR activity. Essentially looking at how business practices are changed so that biodiversity concerns are mainstreamed into the policy level of the businesses. Not only policy level, but also production level and decision-making level at both sectoral and other levels. So that is essentially, and we have a strategy which we can discuss at some stage. Now, this current situation has very clearly showed us, and let me explain this from the context of SDGs. If we look at SDGs 6, 13, 14, and 15, in SDG language, they encompass what we call biosphere component of goals of the SDG. So these essentially are the biosphere component which underpins economic and social well-being of society. And it is very clear that unless we make sure that this biosphere component is fully protected, it is going to have a negative impact on how we live as a society, how we behave as a society, and how our economy is affected. In this context, let me also quickly introduce you two areas which have come to fore. One is nature-based solutions. And nature-based solutions, as we all know, are solutions which are provided by nature. Either they are nature-derived solutions like wind energy or hydropower, or they are nature-inspired solutions like biomimicry, for instance, or they are nature-based solutions in the sense that how do we work with nature to provide us with ecosystem services which help society and businesses. And in here, let me introduce a concept which is a concept of agriscapes in terms of how do we improve the ecosystems around agriculture areas, for instance, whether it's a forest or it's a river or it's a wetland. How do we improve the ecosystem services of these sort of sources to improve the agriculture productivity, which helps both the farmers in terms of improved livelihoods, improved income, and also it helps the businesses which are dependent on agriculture productivity. The second thing I would like to introduce is this concept of forest landscape restoration. Now, you might have heard of something called Bond Challenge, which is essentially a pledge which countries have made to ecologically restore 200 million hectares by 2020 and 350 million hectares by 2030. Now, again, essentially what we are doing here is by restoring these ecosystems, again, we are making sure that we provide the use of rights and usufructory requirements of all the people who are dependent on natural resources, as well as improving the ecosystem flow, which helps the society at large, and also addressing some of the climate change concerns. Now, coming to the current situation of the COVID, it's absolutely clear that deforestation is driving wild animals out of their natural habitats, and they are coming closer to human, and the contact is increasing, and we see the results. So what we need to do again is to make sure that by building back better, we make sure that the ecosystem services which have been lost are restored. Why did I say building back better? If you recall, during the 2004 tsunami, we had, there was devastation in many countries. And we had a program in about 11 or 12 countries in Asia. And what we found was that a lot of money was being pumped in. And where in a village there were only 50 boats, suddenly after all this rehabilitation, we found there are 150 boats, which means that the pressure on fisheries increased. So in this case also, we will need to be very careful in terms of how we build back better when we return to or when we approach normalcy. Thank you very much for this. Is my first. I see that my 7 minutes over now.
Thank you. Thank you very much for saying. Thank you also for keeping very closely on time. I think you've raised a number of very interesting issues: agriscapes, forest landscape restoration. I think this whole notion about the relationship between man and not only climate, but all living organisms, which to a certain extent has been ruptured or disturbed in the process of growth and development. We will come to it in the question answer session. I'm just flagging the issue for the present. So now let me turn to our second speaker. This is Mr. Anirban Ghosh. As I introduced earlier, he is the Chief Sustainability Officer at the Mahindra Group. Under his leadership, Mahindra has developed an award-winning sustainability framework, become a founding member of the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition, and the first to commit to doubling energy productivity, which I suppose means also energy efficiency. He has, in partnership with the World Bank, facilitated the creation of the Sustainable Housing Leadership Consortium to accelerate the spread of green buildings in India. Anirban Ghosh has also been an invited speaker to the COP21 and is acknowledged as a distinguished sustainability officer. May I invite you, Mr. Anirban Ghosh, to make your intervention.
Thank you, Ambassador. It's an honor and a privilege to be on this platform and to discuss on this issue. If there is one lesson that COVID has taught us, it is that we as human beings have been living beyond natural boundaries consistently. As a result of which, nature in many different ways has been complaining. COVID is only the last one that we've seen right now, and by no means is it going to be the last way in which nature will complain to us. Those of us who are maybe up to 30 years old would possibly think that things like clean air, clean water, etc. are figments of human imagination, because we've possibly not seen anything different. However, COVID has given us a glimpse of what is possible, of how clean the air can be, how nice the water can be, how nature can thrive, and so on. The northeast of India actually has a huge opportunity ahead of it. It's always had it, and luckily it is still there. In the current circumstances, it's probably the right time to ask the question, what do we want the northeast of India to look like 50 years from now? How will people of this area live, work, and play? Should we let development proceed in the same higgledy-piggledy ramshackle manner that it normally does, and then try to retrofit good things into what has happened, which usually is never good for biodiversity or the environment? We have heard the term tragedy of the commons, but why must the commons always be tragedy must always be inflicted on the commons? This is why it's important to ask the question that if development means urbanization, and it has always meant urbanization, then what should urbanization be like in the northeast of India 50 years from now? What should be the extent and what should be the nature? It is in this context that there are a number of businesses that the Mahindra Group has got into, because we believe these businesses will enable responsible urbanization in the future. Ambassador, you kindly mentioned the green building initiatives that we've taken. We truly believe that any building built today should be built green, because building green buildings is no longer more expensive than building non-green buildings. This is a change that has happened in the recent past. We believe that transportation needs to be clean, which is why we're investing heavily into electric vehicles. But electric vehicles is one form of transportation. We understand that if transportation has to be clean, public transportation in the form of metros, in the form of clean buses, are much more important than personal vehicles, even if they are to be driven using electric means. We believe that water must be managed well. 70% of clean water is used in agriculture. Therefore, we must use technologies like micro irrigation. Else, we will have a water shortage, which will drive all sorts of trouble in the societies that we have. And of course, energy must be clean, which is why we've invested in renewable energy. So these are all offshoots of a vision of the future where urbanization and the way we live, work, and play will be completely clean and not of the kind that it is today. But if this is to happen in the Northeast, it is absolutely necessary that policy precede business. Because if we are to go forward in the business as usual manner and then try to retrofit clean into business and the way we live, it will be an uphill task, as we can see in the rest of the world today. The whole conversation of climate change is because we are dealing with unintended consequences of technology which we were delighted with when it was first discovered. But we've now found out that each one of these technologies, like fossil fuels, like transportation, and so many more, have effects which are not good for nature. And as the scale of these effects increase, we are dealing with a potential slow poison called climate change, which could be far more dangerous than a bullet called COVID. So if policy precedes business, we have a chance then to ensure that the ecosystem services that are so crucial, not just for business, but also for human beings to live comfortably, will be protected, and we will be able to provide that. Dr. Singh explained the importance of ecosystem services very, very clearly. But if we want to ensure that the ecosystem services are not threatened, as they tend to get threatened in any area that supposedly goes through development, policy must precede business, even if that were to put some strictures on how business and how development were to occur. Because if we don't do that, given the way we operate so far, I don't think we really have a chance. And if we don't do that, we have to live with what we've often called the tragedy of the commons. And this is where the word naturenomics has a very interesting implication, shall we say. Notice that nature comes before economics. And usually nature provides input for economics, and it's always never the other way around. And we are dealing with a situation of ensuring that economics happens, development happens, people live comfortably, but not at the cost of nature, because it is almost like cutting off the branch that you're sitting on. It is almost like killing the golden goose. And if we want to prevent that, we have to ensure that policy precedes business. And when business does happen, we must focus on ensuring that it is green business done in a green manner. And now is the time to enable businesses to adopt lines of business which are inherently green, like green buildings, like electric vehicles, like micro irrigation, like shared mobility, and many others whose carbon footprint is low, who do not have a huge imposition on the ecosystem in which they operate. If we are able to do this, then the glimpse that we've got from COVID can become a reality and will not remain a glimpse. And one hopes that the northeast of India will be able to show the way, because it still has a chance. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ghosh. Again, a very important point. Policy should precede business. And of course, a question that I leave to you is also, of course, I accept that, but at the same time, what can business do to lead policy? Maybe in the Q&A, we could come back to that question.
Sure.
I will now turn to our third speaker, but before I turn to our third speaker, may I also just flag 3 questions that I think some of our viewers have been posing on the Q&A, and these are essentially definitional questions. What are SDGs? What is green building? And what are ecosystem services? So perhaps, if not directly by Mr. Bhattacharjee, when you come to your question and answers, please explain green building in your case, ecosystem services in Whoever's case, and SDG. Mr. Nababrata, he is currently the chairman of the Environmental Appraisal Committee of Meghalaya, an expert member of the Meghalaya State Planning Board. He is a former commissioner of the National Green Tribunal and is involved with various committees of the National Green Tribunal, including committees for Meghalaya and for the Northeast region. So very much the right person for this debate, especially when we have issues like the Behin Patkai and the Dibang projects before us. Mr. Bhattacharjee has also served in multiple environmental advisory roles in the Asian Development Bank and in the Japan International Cooperation for the Green Meghalaya, including serving as environmental safeguard specialist for JICA. He has played a pioneering role in rolling out tea plantations in Arunachal as a voluntary general manager of cash crops with the Arunachal Pradesh government. Prior to this, he served in the Arunachal Pradesh Forest Corporation and has trained with the Indian Forest Research Institute, NDI Gurgaon, and the Toklai Tea Research Association. Mr. Bhattacharjee is a member of the BCCI Executive Council, where he served on the Roadway Reforms Committee, and he is currently a member of the Northeast Task Force. May I invite you, Mr. Bhattacharjee, to make your presentation before we come to the Q&A. Thank you. You have the floor.
Yeah, very good evening, Ambassador Mukhopadhyay, and my gratitude to the Balipara Foundation for inviting me to this very distinguished panel. So this particular, am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, you're fine.
So I think the topic today, this evening, or the preceding one, is in the backdrop of the pandemic, if I'm not mistaken. At least the shadow of the pandemic looms large on this slew of panel discussions which we have on the anvil. I think the response to COVID-19 has demonstrated to the entire world that what can be done differently and accordingly influencing our behavior. Influencing our, am I audible?
Yes, yes. Please carry on.
Yeah, influencing our behavior in significant ways, all of which not necessarily reverse after these restrictions or what we call the lockdowns are lifted. Through this, we have already overcome an important barrier to behavioral change. I think all of you will agree that it may be a 60 or 65, 75 days odd to behavioral change. And I would term it as the new normal, which may see less unnecessary interventions, which we have seen this COVID has brought in. Now this COVID-19, consequent to the lockdown, has changed the entire system. If you see the pollution aspect, you see when some of the polluting factors like emission of ambient, emission of your greenhouse gases, you see the environment adjusted to it and how the ambient air quality improved all over the mainland. Here I would like to confine myself to the Northeast, and particularly when we are talking of the Eastern Himalayas. Now, when we talk of improvement, which has been attained in the mainland of the country, I'll not go to the international sphere. You see, it would have taken normally about 30 to 40 years to reach the state which we are experiencing, particularly during the lockdown period. Although the process of reversal has already started in metros like Delhi, Calcutta, and all these places, with the gradual lifting of the lockdown. And we have also simultaneously seen a spike, which is reaching the peak. Now it's about 8,000, 9,000 cases daily. So here we can directly find a correlation which exists between nature and human, or even other living. So this, that the deforestation, the extraction of fossil fuels, the contamination of our water bodies, the agricultural lands which has been defiled. So all these has added to distortion of the equilibrium, and thus setting in, one of which is the pandemic which we see today. Now coming back to Northeast, there has not been marked change. The Northeast or the Eastern Himalayas have always enjoyed a pristine environment. There has been a slide, but it is much better compared to the mainland India. Now, when we talk of this, we are talking of how we take advantage of the prevailing situation in the environment vis-a-vis industry. But how far Northeast has been able to harness this potential, which is intrinsic and innate. There is a close bondage. I'm talking particularly about the hill states or the hill regions of the Eastern Himalayas and the Northeastern states. There has been always centuries of close bond between the settlers here and environment. There has been a symbiotic relationship. But how have we been able to take advantage of the situation? I think very minimal has been done to extract this. And then when we come to the industries or the business module developed for the Northeast, I think I'll not be wrong, but it may be not been agreed by many, that the investment by the industries, I'm not talking about the government, because today we are talking about the industrial relation, has been virtually symbolic to harness this potential. And these Eastern Himalayas must bank and develop on its innate strength. And what is the innate strength of these Eastern Himalayas? It is not heavy industries, which is not desirable, or it cannot become a Maharashtra model or the cliche Gujarat model. It has to have its own model of growth, development, and providing for livelihood. So with this change in the environment in the mainland, the influence in the Northeast has been minimal. As I earlier said, we already have a pristine environment. So what do we do? How do the industries come forward and help? As I said, it has been tokenism all throughout. Now is the time. We have preceding panelist speakers have talked about CSR. What we need, what we have seen in the CSR activities of the few industries we have here, it has not gone for what we call the environment social responsibility. When we talk of Northeast, we should talk of not CSR per se, but environment social responsibility, because environment, sociality, and economics, social, environment, and economics are all interrelated as far as the Eastern Himalayas are concerned, with environment being at the base of the pyramid. Environment social responsibility by the industries, by the business is very, very important. And together with what we say is the green finance, which is very, very economy to usher in the green economy. And green economy, when we talk of, it cannot be a 1 year or a 2 year. We'll have to look in terms of long-term investment and sustained financing. Public budgets have traditionally been an important source of green infrastructure, but given the strains on public finance, large-scale private investment will be needed in the Eastern Himalayas to revamp and to restructure and to build on strength, which is agriculture, which is horticulture, which is ecotourism, and other allied activities like your the medicinal and aromatic plants, beekeeping. So these are the strength core areas of our economies, and we cannot deviate from. And you see what is happening now. This ecosystem is being distorted. We have seen what is happening at the Dihing Patkai, where large reserves of coal are being removed in a manner which sees no respite. We have seen what is happening in the Divang Valley Hydel project. Why do we need to go for a 300 megawatt power generation when we can come up with small hydel projects like 300, 400 megawatt? Similarly, we have seen the removal of fossil fuel from other states, including my own state in Meghalaya. So what has happened? We are at the Eastern Himalayas is at the crossroads, whether to harness the inherent strength or whether to go for borrowed economies. So this is where we need to put our heads together and come to a point of convergence where the environment and the Northeast and its strength merges so that we come out with a model where the people, the livelihood, and the innate strength of the region blends to come out with a solution which we all need for Northeast. So as far as the environment is concerned, we already have pristine environment. It is the thing of financing and how we harness this situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bhattacharjee. Again, a very rich contribution, and I'd like to thank actually all the panelists for very, very stimulating presentation. Now, the number of questions that this has thrown up for me will probably require about 5 minutes just to articulate. So let me just actually quickly flag a few points. Some of them will be directed to some people. Some of them will be more general, and you can pick them up as you wish. I think first, starting with Mr. Bhattacharjee, you made a few very interesting comments about the pristine nature of the Northeast. Therefore, in fact, in a way, it has a head start in being able to move towards a low carbon and towards a more sustainable, Naturenomics model, shall we say. But can you elaborate a little, for example, on when you say the Northeast should have its own model, what could be the elements of that model? To me, it's obvious that 75 to 80% of people of the Northeast live off land, water, and sun, mainly in subsistence, agriculture, animal husbandry, fishing, forest products, horticulture, and related things like foraging and so on. In the previous session, a very interesting question was raised that Mr. Saurabh Malhotra also brought, which is what is our system of accounting in which both neither nature nor the future is taken into account. In other words, when we evaluate the value of a tree cut in a forest, we don't actually evaluate the value of a tree in a forest. And we don't evaluate the cost in terms of what is the cost to future generations, so that there is a premium on spending now. And all this, of course, contributing to an overconsumptive kind of society. So what is this kind of, if you can flesh out a little more, your vision of this model for the Northeast that takes into account actually all the very important points that you made. But a few more general questions. I think one question was that. The second is, I already see, and I think Mr. Ghosh had flagged this, that there is a temptation and a tendency, and I noticed in business bodies, the talk is about how does India benefit from the relocation, let's say, of industries from China? So basically, it's the same model, but how can we capitalize at the expense of someone else? There is not adequate thinking on the model of development, the model of growth, and the model of business. How can we, take this once in a lifetime, once in a generation opportunity to try and, revise our very notions and bring it to public consciousness, right to the lowest level. A third question, again, a question of great opportunity, is how is it, now we have this phenomenon of migrants, and many of the migrants are going back to their rural origins. Many of them are making a choice that between being poor in the cities and being poor in the villages, they would rather choose the comfort of their own environment and their kith and kin in the villages. How can we convert this into a movement back towards a kind of much more rural futures and much more holistic model of growth, bring rural development, which has virtually gone out of the development agenda, back into the agenda. And in this context, and this is, I'm not advocating for anything that the government or the Prime Minister is saying, but the Prime Minister's slogan, let me call it, of self-reliance and going local, how can we use that in order to make a movement back towards a more holistic rural environment? And finally, on this whole question of policies that should precede business, anyone, I would invite them to articulate a little on the kind of policies that you would advocate, or at least one or two key elements of policy that should make this change. I know, I'm sorry that that's a lot of questions, but you don't need to answer all of them. Just answer what you feel is the most important and the most relevant.
Yeah, Ambassador, you're asking me?
I think we could start off with you, since I started off with the first question, and then go ahead to, in reverse direction, Mr. Ghosh, and then Dr. TPC.
Yeah, pertaining to the model which you have mentioned, so I would say in one sentence, all along till now, whether from the state level, policymakers, or from the center, it has been a classic example of missing the woods for the trees. You see, we have not had, I think, Ambassador, you'll be aware that in the 1990s, 1980s, we were talking of Vision 2020. Then we have been talking about the low-caste policy. Then we have now talking about the act-ist policy. You see, Northeast is geographically, mentally, your origin-wise is more closer to Southeast Asia, which you will agree. Right from the food habits to your system, to your affinity in the culture, a lot of tradition. But in the long 30, 35 years, 40 years, in spite of talking all this, we have till today not been able to make this vital connection between the Northeast and the Southeast Asia, where all the hill states and regions of the Northeast has lost out. We have lost those 40 golden, 30, 40 golden years. Now, coming to the policy has to emanate from a bottoms-up policy. A policy which is good for Maharashtra need not necessarily be good for Meghalaya or Sikkim. We cannot put a uniform policy for the entire country. I think that itself is missing. My plan allocation is this much, my road is this much, my industry is this much, my harnessing, my royalty is this much, my revenue driven is this much. We cannot have a same uniform policy. Now, what we need for these Eastern Himalayas, I'll again revert back. that what is the strength of these areas. I'll give you an example, Ambassador. I think that will prove my point. You see, like Sikkim is an organic state. Today we are talking of pandemic. We may have many more pandemic. Can you see the USP of this region when we talk, and we talk in the international forum, in the national forum, that these are the states, because of its pristine environment and ecology, small population, and the discipline and tradition of the people, has been able to keep the pandemic at bay to a large extent. I think all of you will agree, compared to the mainland India. So when we talk of tourism tomorrow, you go to a place which is pandemic insulated, the whole world will look up and say, it's like this, so we should make our next visit there. Tomorrow, today there is pandemic, tomorrow there will be something else. So there has to be out of box thinking of how we harness the thing, and we develop that economic model and the livelihoods. I'll give you an example, end with an example. When the Donipolo tea estate in Arunachal Pradesh started their, what do you call, the bio tea or the green tea or organic tea, whatever nomenclature you give it. When they came up in the market, people said your yield per hectare is hardly 27 to 32% of what a normal CTC on orthodox tea will give. But Donipolo insisted on that from quality, I will make much more than what I make from the quantity. And Ambassador, you may be aware, in the tea auction, at one stage, 12 to 14,000 rupees was per kg of Donipolo silver lining tea which was selling. So you see, they got 25, 30 times more than what a normal orthodox or CTC tea was fetching. So these are the types of value addition. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. No time for further discussion on it. We'll come towards the end. Mr. Ghosh.
Thank you, Ambassador. You mentioned there were three very basic questions really as to what is green building, what is ecosystem services, and what is SDGs. If you don't mind, I'd just suggest quick definitions. So green buildings are buildings which, because of the way they are built and the material used to build them, are able to reduce energy consumption, water consumption, and make it more comfortable for the people who live in them. That's a short definition. There's more to it. Ecosystem service is very interesting. Understanding is not very clear amongst people. Let me just give three examples. The fact that we get water to drink, it's an ecosystem service. The fact that there is air for us to breathe, that's an ecosystem service. The fact that there are bees that do pollination and therefore the crops grow, that's an ecosystem service. These are three examples. There are many more. We usually take ecosystem services completely for granted and work very hard willy-nilly, maybe not intentionally, to destroy the ecosystem services that we are getting for free. Most usually because we're getting them for free. So, and the third one was SDGs. Full form is Sustainable Development Goals, developed by the United Nations. They are 16 goals to achieve and 1 partnerships, manner in which to achieve the 16 goals. One can go into depth, but these goals are like eliminating poverty, clean energy, and so on. So there's 16, 17. Those are the 3 that were asked. When it comes to policy, Ambassador, you'd ask me to address how business should shape policy. You'll know better than me that policy in our country usually has been schizophrenic. And you do something now, and Mr. Bhattacharjee mentioned some examples already. Unless you regard do as you wish, laissez-faire as a policy, in which case we've been consistent. Now, there are times when policy succeeds. That's when, if you make a policy and alternatives are available for people to adopt, and the policy can be implemented without much difficulty, policy succeeds. If policy implementation requires heavy policing, it does not succeed. So let me give one or two examples of how business can shape good policy for environment in the future. Number one, we've discussed green buildings. Today, green buildings do not cost more than non-green buildings. India has yet to build 70% of the buildings that it needs by 2050. There is no reason why a non-green building should be built anymore. It is ripe for policy so that people who don't understand green buildings, if they simply follow the policy, will end up building green buildings.
Can you also just elaborate whether these are being translated into building codes, construction codes?
Yes. So the good news is that a small step has been taken. There is a section on sustainability in the Indian National Building Codes. It's a step in the right direction. However, it does not ensure that every building that is built green. We do not have the time for people to discover that green buildings are good. It might take 100 years for that to happen. So therefore, it is necessary to bring in policy so that everything we build is built green. So this is one example in the way in which business can make good policy happen by making it clear to policymakers that an alternative is available, that by following the new policy, everybody will benefit. And this is not something which we are asking because of some vested interest. I could give you more examples like that because technology is making these examples possible today. I would love to discuss the issue of migrants and why they need to migrate and so on. It will take a lot of time, but I do want to share one insight that the people migrate from rural areas to other areas to work simply because of the uncertainty of income from agriculture. The risks are so high that they need to de-risk it either by a second source of income or a source of income that is stable and steady and comes in the form of a salary, which is why a government job is so sought after. You and I may think people don't want to work, so they want a government job. No, the main motivation is because it gives a steady income which offsets the riskiness of agriculture income. There is more, but this is an insight which we got. I've spent more than 15, 16 years in our agriculture business, met at least 5,000 to 7,000 farmers. So this is an insight we understand and try to work with. Industries coming to India from China, yes, it's an opportunity. But we know that if the industrialization continues to happen in the way it has happened so far, it could also bring about a lot of disaster. We've seen areas of Uttarakhand inviting industry. It has not gone completely overboard, but definitely 30 years down the line, I don't think that area will be as pristine as it was when we started out. Nor will it probably be as nice as it should be. It probably will have the characteristics that folks are saying that an area should have. For example, there should be 33% forest cover. That's now a worldwide accepted norm. Luckily, in the Northeast, most areas have more than 33% today. But if development occurs in the way it normally occurs, we will not have 33%, we'll go below. And that is not a desirable thing at all. One could build on this and talk about the issues Mr. Bhattacharjee has brought up, but I don't think we have the time for that. The seeds have been sown. I'm sure Balipara Foundation will find ways of taking this conversation forward.
Unfortunately, that is the reality. Sort of one question, would you like to put the questions from the audience as well into the discussion right away before Dr. Singh speaks?
Yes, so actually, sir, there are about 14 questions. I'm just going to try and summarize and put forward 2 questions that sort of could be answered in this time. So the first question is that COVID has brought far off intellectually perceived risks into the cold reality of the present time. Will corporates and governments move environmental concerns from regulatory or compliance departments into core strategic or financial risk management and planning departments? That is one. The second is talking about technology and what, in the view of the panel, is the current maturity of the deployment of technology as an enablement towards the preservation of biodiversity or the environment, and whether technology is a part of the current movement or initiative towards decision making, innovation, and actually monitoring progress of biodiversity conservation and preservation in the future.
Yeah. Yeah. Can I, on the second question, just pose a little addition? Can, for example, things like AI help us in our sustainability goals?
Exactly. Yeah. So that was pretty much a summary. I mean, there are many more questions. We don't have the time, but I think we will
have the time. We can keep it like that. Let's
answers.
give Dr. Singh is probably you have the last word.
Is it to me?
Yeah.
Okay. Before I come to this question, one point that you had raised earlier was valuation of ecosystem services. How do we value a tree, for instance? I mean, it's just not the wood, but the carbon storage capacity, etc., etc. It's a very complex matter. There is something called the economics of ecosystem and biodiversity, or TEEB studies, which have tried to value various components of ecosystem, forests, for instance. Just to give you an example, one rough valuation was that one vulture provides $10,000 worth of service in its life in terms of disposing of carcasses. So there are such studies, but these are all complex issues and they are very subjective. I mean, you can value oxygen at whatever rate that you wish to do. The other, I just wanted to add one or two more positive issues in terms of what industry is doing. I mean, we work very closely with industries, and there are industries, I'm not talking of national policies or state level policies, but just to give you an idea, they are adopting a group-wide, for instance, biodiversity policy, which subscribes to the concept of no net loss of biodiversity. And then this is a mining industry, and then for each mine, they have a biodiversity management plan in terms of how they are going to rehabilitate those mines. There is another company, ITC, for instance, which is focusing on ecosystem services, provided how ecosystem services can be improved to improve agriculture productivity. So there are a lot of industries which are working on internal policies to mainstream biodiversity concerns into their own efforts. Now, coming to technology and whether we have tools to measure biodiversity, yes, there are tools like IBAT, for instance, which allow us to measure the level of biodiversity, and there are other innovations, but they are not as refined as they are in other fields of areas. As far as use of AI, etc., AI is concerned, it's a new field for us also in the world of environment.
Especially Internet of Things.
Yes, yeah. So these are all sort of new areas which we are trying to get into. And lastly, I would say that whether it's an issue of industries moving from China to India, we have to keep one thing in mind, that the economic center of gravity is shifting towards east. And this has been indicated by many academicians and experts. So there is going to be an increased infrastructure development, increased urbanization in our part of the world. So the better equipped we are now to deal with these issues, the better it is.
Thank you. Thank you. I would like to thank all our panelists for their contributions. Really, this discussion could have carried on in much greater detail with each of you for a much longer time, taking very specific issues as well. It is my misfortune that we don't really have the time for that. But I think in any case, all of you have flagged certain issues. I think 2 or 3 things seem to me particularly key. One is that COVID-19 is a moment of opportunity to push a much more green agenda and a much more holistic development agenda in the country and worldwide. And we should not just go back to business practices as usual in the past. The second is quite clearly the importance of the role of policy And in particular, with reference to the Northeast, the opportunity that this gives, and the opportunity, a number of things, including migration. And I've seen examples of this in my own area, where lots of people are now coming back and actually understanding the importance of agriculture a little more. For example, I see many more people cultivating land. I see a growing market for agricultural land. And people realize that in a way, risks are better mitigated back in their homes rather than outside. I think this whole question that, the relationship between an anthropocentric world and the entire world of living organisms. I mean, climate change is something that has now found its place in our agenda. But the relationship between man and living organisms in the larger scale of things, I mean, what we are seeing today, it's not that it has not happened in the past, but it could be a precursor for many worse things happening in future. And sometimes in conjunction with many other kinds of disasters. So I think these are all very important things, but the most crucial thing is simply this, that I think there is a moment of opportunity to push the green agenda, to push the Naturenomics with the revolution, to push all these concepts like a circular economy, ecosystem services, natural assets, natural capital. And of course, all of you are very much in the front line of that. And if these things can be mainstreamed as business, if business itself can go green, business makes the world go round. And if business itself can go green, then the world itself will move towards. Thank you. And I think with those words, I will end this evening's session. Once again, on behalf of the Valuation Foundation, very strong thanks to all our three panelists who have brought their expertise to our audiences and to each of us.